Okay, welcome again. This is ECO415 lecture 3. Prior to the recording, we discussed some of the country cases. Now we're going to continue with our slides. Last time when we were discussing comparative economic development, we left our discussion at historical differences. So here, basically, we want to understand how low-income countries today differ from the, developed countries in their earlier stages. Remember the first week I discussed that, I told you that today's developed economies were also poor and were also underdeveloped in historical standards, right? In terms of GDP per capita, in terms of population, in terms of urbanization rates, in terms of the share of labor working in agriculture, etc. These were typical elements in today's developed economies in their historically earlier stages. So, interestingly, of course, today's low-income countries or underdeveloped countries face a different world, face different constraints. So there are some differences. One type of differences are about physical and human resource endowments. Okay, of course, countries differ geographically. We already discussed that, but also historically, there were some differences. Okay. You may imagine that one thing that is important here is population, of course. Okay, population levels differ, and population momentum, basically the population growth rate, differs. Also important, I guess, is capital stock, right? Some of these low-income countries today already experienced, for instance, the colonial regimes, some sort of modernization or political independence. So these create differences if you compare today's low-income economy and, for instance, England in two centuries ago or 3 centuries ago. Per capita incomes and levels of GDP in relation to the rest of the world. So in the earlier stages, when when the British economy became the factory of the world, the relative GDP share of then developing countries, of course, differed. What we observe today for low-income economies. That also depends on how much you produce and what do you produce, right? A third issue is climate. When, during the times of the Industrial Revolution, for instance, the world was much more cooler, right? The air was much more cleaner, basically. So there are some differences in terms of climate. In terms of physical and human resource endowments, one important thing, again, is population size, distribution, and growth. When we call distribution, we may imagine different things. There could be a difference in regional distribution, right? Today's, in many developing economies, population is much more concentrated in cities. In the earlier centuries, for today's developed economies, when they were taking into growth, population was much more dispersed, right? There is also a difference in terms of age distribution, right? In low fertility economies, populations are much more older. Okay, populations are generally older. And we also observed that during the times of the British takeoff, fertility and more, for instance, if you again look at the case of England, we observed that there is high fertility, high mortality, and population growth rate is low, right? Because of both high mortality and high fertility. But in today's typical developing economy or underdeveloped economy, because of the mortality revolution, even if fertility is still high, since mortality is low, we observe a high population growth rate, and that creates some demographic imbalances and economic imbalances. Okay. International migration also differs. Okay. Today, as you know, there's a flow of people from low-income economies to high-income economies for different reasons. Some of this is forced migration, as we now experience after the civil war in Syria, for instance. But some of it is, deliberate choices of people that search for better lives, that search for employment, that search for higher incomes, that search for better standards of living for themselves and for their kids. So historically, there are differences then. So we see much more mobility from low income to high income economies. Of course, there was a mobility for, if you think about Western Europe, 300 years ago, there is of course a mobility among European nations, but that was of a different character than what we observe today. Because in 3 centuries ago, in let's say 1700s, there was not much income difference between different economies. So people still migrated, but for different reasons possibly, right? Not because, France is much more richer than England. That was not the case, but possibly there are different mechanisms. So the historical role of international migration differs. Regarding international trade benefits, we kind of discussed this last week, but imagine this. What do you have in terms of physical and human endowments kind of affects what do you specialize in, right, as an economy. And what do you specialize in is also related with, have some consequences for what do you sell and how much do you sell it for, okay, and where to sell it. So all of these things were kind of different. So for today's developed economies, the main dynamic that determines this, of course, the waves of globalization or colonialism, basically, right? The colonial relationships were much more important. But now, underdeveloped or developing economies are independent political entities. Yes, of course, there's diverse technology. Yes, of course, there's also diversity in physical capital endowments, human capital endowments, population sizes, right? I mean, China is still a labor-abundant economy, although they switch gradually to become a capital-abundant or knowledge-abundant economy. So they create, product upgrades. They switch to producing slightly more capital-intensive goods, etc. But those trade benefits differed a lot. Market opportunities differed a lot, and the pace of technological progress created those differences as well. Also interesting and underlined in your text is the differences in scientific and technological endowments or capabilities. So what do I mean by that? Imagine the early industrializing countries, such as, again, England, France, Germany, etc. So in these countries, formal science, as we understand it today, was still in the earliest stages, okay? There was not a very strong link between science and technology. So scientific knowledge, which is useful for technological progress, was there, of course, and it is used, for instance, Newtonian mechanics, right? So Newtonian mechanics is, for instance, a body of knowledge which was very important for the, creation of what we call today the first industrial revolution. But that type of knowledge was not necessarily created in modern universities or by people that are typically professional scientists, okay? Today, we have a different world, of course. There's a modern university system in developed countries and some of the developing economies. So underdeveloped and other developing economies try to transfer this knowledge, sometimes directly, because there are two different things here. One is basic research, and the other is applied research. So basic research is basically the foundational scientific research that would allow us to create new technologies, and applied research is much more industry-based and much more applied, right? So it uses the foundational knowledge coming from basic research and apply it in commercial areas. So it is much more profit-oriented. So developing countries today or underdeveloped countries today, in that regard, face a very different world. What the first, British industrialists or French industrialists faced in a couple of centuries ago. And domestic institutions. Now, we discussed that institutions matter a lot, and we will see in the upcoming weeks how different type of formal and informal institutions matter for development outcomes and also are affected by the patterns of economic and social and political development, right? So most of the today's developed economies were near feudal economies. So when there is a takeoff to modern growth, in that economy, the institutional setup was much more feudal than what we observe today. So of course, creation of capitalism is strongly related with, the emergence of the capitalist regime is strongly related with takeoff to the modern growth and also strongly related with technological progress. So what we observe today is, politically independent countries governed by a president or a parliamentary regime, which is of course another issue that may be important, but their effectiveness, the effectiveness of these different domestic institutions matter a lot. So, when there is industrial revolution for the first time in Britain, then France, and then Germany, then in the United States. So those economies were just still realizing the meaning of the nation state. Okay? Today's underdeveloped or developing economies already know what a nation state is, what's the role of, for instance, national development plan, and what are the constraints, and how the international political system affects their political capabilities. Okay, so if you read the text, there is much wider discussion than what I offer here for you. But those differences also matter, right? So it is not like, all right, there is this idea of modernization, there is this idea of growth takeoffs, there is this idea of industrialization and urbanization and technological progress and demographic transition. So England realized this as a first example. So then we can copy this, for instance, today in Kenya, or we can copy this in, imagine the early years of our own Republic of Turkey. Just after the World War I, just after the National Liberation War, we have this economy, largely agrarian, not having too much capital, technologically highly underdeveloped. So it is not a feasible project to think about, all right, let's look at the case in 18th century England and we follow the same path. You cannot do that. You face different constraints, you face different endowments, you face a different world system, you face different international trade relationships, you face a different composition of population, different age composition, different regional composition, what you produce, what you can sell, where to sell it, all matters and all are different. Okay, so those differences matter. Otherwise, it would be a simple mathematical model that you can run so that you know what worked in England, then you apply it in Turkey. So it's not like that. But I'm not saying it is all relative. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying there are no patterns. Of course, there are patterns. Once a country once the country initiated economic development, we observe typical things, but at different paces. Slightly different, with slightly different outcomes. Okay, so you may want to check the textbook in a couple of pages. Those dimensions of historical differences are explained in a much better way than I did here. Now, another interesting issue that is important for comparative development is the issue of convergence versus divergence. Okay, now convergence is a term that we use in many different contexts, but in development economics, or for comparative economic development much more specifically, we use it to mean the convergence or divergence of income levels, or the convergence or divergence of growth rates. Okay, in fact, according to one economist, Robert Lucas, the entire issue of economic development is basically those differences. If those differences in real GDP per capita levels or the growth rate of real GDP per capita levels converge in time, then it is one story of successful economic development for the entire planet. Or if these incomes and growth rates diverge, this means some of the countries grow and become rich, and some of the countries remain poor and grow a little or stagnate in the very long run. Okay, so the convergence literature. So this issue of convergence versus divergence was also my research project in my master's thesis, which I completed in 2005 in Ankara University. So you can actually access it online. So I studied back in the time. I studied the world income distribution and the idea of club convergence. So the graphs you see here look for what we call beta convergence. Okay. So on the vertical axis, you see average growth rates. So these are kind of long run growth rates. Okay. I will explain more in a moment. On the horizontal axis, you see the income levels at some initial period. So here for these figures, this initial period is 1980. Okay, so in 1980, I record the income levels, real GDP per capita income. Okay, real GDP per capita, sorry, or real income per capita, shorter. And I put this on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, I look at the growth rate, average growth rate of per capita income after 1980, right? So basically, I am asking whether poorer economies grow faster, right? Because if poorer economies grow faster, on average, in relative terms, there is convergence, right? If richer economies grow slower, and if poorer economies grow faster, then this means in terms of relative income levels, there will be a lower variance in the long run, right? That kind of idea. So what do you see here? The overall picture is that there is no convergence, right? Because we want this relationship to be inverse, to be negatively correlated. We want these variables to be negatively correlated so that poorer economies grow faster, and then we have relative income convergence. Okay. As you see, in global terms, there's no such convergence. But if you look at only the OECD economies, okay, there is that correlation. Now, this looks at a wider time span. What happens after 1950, as you see, right? After 1950, we see that in OECD, poor economies grow faster. These initially poor economies include Japan, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Ireland, Italy, and that goes on. The richer economies are, initial richer economies are Luxembourg, United States, Switzerland, Austria, Canada, Netherlands, etc. Right? So this is now much more, of course, strong. I mean, this is a strong correlation here. Turkey and Luxembourg are kind of outliers in this picture, but Turkey is always an outlier in OECD in many different contexts. But what we see here is that for a group of countries, there is convergence. Now, why is that? Why do you think there is no global convergence, but there is some degree of convergence if we look at only one group of countries? Here, the examples OECD. Now, this idea is called conditional convergence. Okay, it is called conditional convergence, which basically says that countries converge if they are similar. Okay. Similar in what respects? Well, similar in saving rates, similar in population growth rates, similar in initial per capita income levels, similar in other respects that affect the growth process in the economy. All right. So if you want to check a paper about this, if you are interested in this concept, you can of course check my master's thesis. Again, you can access it online. You can Google it. If you Google Hacettepe, world income distribution, convergence, etc., you can access it. If you cannot, just let me know. I can send it to you. Also, you can check one interesting paper written by Mankiw, Romer, and Weil. Okay, I think it is 1992. I think it is cited in your textbook, but again, if you cannot find it, just let me know and I can send the link to you. All right. So here then we can compare some different concepts again. So one is again relative country convergence, which basically means poorer countries growing faster. Okay, and we see that there is conditional convergence in that regard. In terms of absolute country convergence, we see very large initial differences, and we look at basically the variance of income levels. So we are basically ignoring away the growth process, just look at the variance of, let's say, log incomes in time. If this variance goes lower, right, if this variance decreases, then we say there is absolute convergence in income levels across countries. Now, one interesting issue, of course, especially after 1980s, is the issue of faster growth in large economies. Here, the idea is, of course, you know, the interesting examples are India and China, and to some extent, you know, countries such as Indonesia as well. So those countries grew faster after 1980s. If you do not take the weighted average, weighted by population, you basically treat each country as a country whose population is just equal to 1. Okay? Because real GDP per capita gives you an average measure of income in the country, right? But some of these countries are, in terms of population, they're bigger countries, especially China and India. They are huge, right? So if these countries growing very fast, then you need to take into account the population level, all right? And there are some figures in your text that shows you interesting results. There is also another approach to world income distribution or convergence versus divergence issues, and that's the approach that takes the entire world as a single economy. Okay, so here I think Branko Milanovic and some other former World Bank specialists work on this project. So they basically look at the household level data, and they create a common measure that you can compare, through which you can compare different countries through time, right? So you look at a household in China, another household in Canada, another household in Turkey, and another household in Brazil, right? So if you try to find, if you find a common measure, a common income measure for each of these households, then you can compare, you can take the entire world, entire 8 billion people living as if they live in a single economy, so you can compare their incomes. Okay? There are some papers in that particular subgroup, sub-literature that say, if you look at it in this way, inequality decreased in the recent decades. Okay. Now there is also this thing called club convergence. I will not put so much detail on it. If you are interested, you can again check my thesis. I specifically discuss club convergence in that particular work. But club convergence basically means that historical differences matter, okay? Not just economic characteristics that affect growth rates, as in the conditional convergence, but also historical initial positions of the country. So there are development traps, okay? There are some threshold levels. If you are poorer than this threshold, then you can never become a member of the rich club, okay? That's the basic idea of club convergence. Now, that's going to become the last part. But let me give the floor to you if you have questions or comments about these historical differences and the concepts of convergence or divergence. Anything?
I have a question about the conditional convergence case.
Okay, go ahead.
So you said that countries converge if they are similar. They are similar in what sense? Okay,
so the idea is that maybe you've seen this model, but you'll definitely see it in the next semester. There is this model called the Solov's growth model. Okay, in the Solov's growth model, countries' long-run income levels are determined by a couple of factors. One is the saving investment rate. Okay, so how much of the GDP is transferred to investment expenditure. Another important parameter in this model is population growth rate. Okay, and another important parameter is the productivity growth rate in the long run. Things like these. All right, and there is another paper, like after 30 years or 40 years after Solov, they try to, they try to approach this issue of convergence versus divergence from the lens of the Solov's model. All right. So if long-run income depends positively on saving rate, for instance, and negatively on population growth rate, we must observe conditional convergence among countries that have similar saving rates and similar population growth rates, for instance. Okay. Now, if you look at OECD and 1950, as in this figure, we observe that these countries have really similar population growth rates in 1950, although income levels differ. They have, you know, similar saving rates. I mean, not too diverse, okay? If you compare Ireland and Finland, for instance, you see, of course, a difference in these parameters. But if you compare Ireland with Uganda, you see a much wider difference, right? If you compare United States with UK, you of course see some differences. But if you compare UK with Sri Lanka, you see a much, much wider difference. So in that respect, conditional convergence underlines differences in the determinants of long-run income levels. Okay, what are these determinants? In the Solow model, these determinants are saving rate, population growth rate, productivity growth rate, etc. In the augmented Solow model, you also have human capital accumulation. So average cycle component of workers also matter, right? So this is especially important if you look at the Monkey, Romer, Weil paper. They actually underline that human capital differences play a large role. But again, in the OECD, the degree of diversity in human capital endowments is much more smaller than if you compare any of these OECD economies to, for instance, an economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so I don't know whether I was clarifying enough. So
yes, thank you.
All right, those issues are about the determinants of long-run income levels. Any other question or comment? All right, then. Now we have around 2 minutes. So let me close this session. And let's take a very small break. Actually, there's video conversion. So, okay, let's take, again, 10 to 15 minutes break. Is that okay for you? Do you hear me?
Yes, it's okay.
So let's meet at 10:45. All right. So the video after video conversion, we can continue. Okay. 10:45, my friends.
Okay. See you.
Okay. Bye bye.